Protests and attacks on Kenyan Parliament after it passed the infamous Finance Bill 2024 in June. The bill had sought to raise an additional $2.7 billion in taxes. The protests forced President William Ruto to do a U-turn on the bill. Dozens have died in clashes between police and protesters who set the parliament ablaze. So why were there protests over the finance bill? Well, the bill had sought to raise taxes on essential commodities such as bread and cooking fuel. This bill was Kenyan government's attempt to help the country deal with a rising spiral of debt. Kenya was in talks with the IMF for a loan assistance. But in lieu of it, IMF asked Kenya to cut its deficit and increase taxes. And hence, the bill was moved. With the bill now abandoned, the future flow of IMF funds to Kenya is in doubt. Kenyans were angry because they are fed up with the burden of rising living costs.
Reject finance bill! Reject finance bill!
So what is the extent of Kenya's debt? Its total domestic and external debt last year was a staggering $80 billion. That's 68% of its GDP and well above the World Bank and IMF recommended maximum of 55%. Kenya's external lenders are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund or the IMF, African Development Bank and nations that lend bilaterally like China. Kenya wants to avoid a default on its debt repayments because with default, loan credibility takes a hit, making future emergency loans a problem. Not just that, default triggers a chain of economic challenges. In Africa, Zambia and Ghana had defaulted on their debt repayments. So Kenya's big worry is its external debt. It has borrowed heavily to finance its infrastructure projects. But growth tanked and expenses rocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic years. The Ukraine war led to a spike in global food and energy prices. This in turn hit Kenya's ability to repay its debt. Now, what made matters worse for Kenya was the tanking of Kenyan currency shilling against the US dollar over the last few years. This swelled up the volume of Kenya's outstanding debt from 42% to 69% of its GDP between 2013 and 2020, without it having borrowed a lot. Like we said earlier, Kenya has borrowed from China too. No surprise there, because there is usually one suspicious party when it comes to debt, particularly in Africa, and that is China. China is Kenya's largest bilateral lender. Its loans account for 64% of Kenya's external bilateral debt. At the end of 2022, Kenya owed China at least $6.7 billion. And China is not known to be very flexible with its repayment schedule. So on expected lines, it has not offered any debt relief to Kenya. Now, Kenya wants financial support from the IMF and the World Bank to repay China. Past experience shows that defaults could potentially lead to asset seizures by China. No wonder then, President Ruto is desperate for more tax revenues to repay China and its other creditors. So what happens now? Ruto says austerity measures would be required and there would be less funding for teachers and development programs. Now, what is India's stance on the debt distress in the global south? As the previous G20 chair, India has been calling for dealing with debt vulnerabilities effectively and with transparency. In fact, during the visit of Kenyan President William Ruto, India extended a line of credit worth $250 million for its agricultural modernization.
दो कृषि प्रधान अर्थव्यवस्थाओं के रूप में हमने अपने अनुभव साझा करने पर सहमति जताई। कीनिया के कृषि क्षेत्र का आधुनिकीकरण करने के लिए हमने $250 मिलियन की लाइन ऑफ क्रेडिट प्रदान करने का भी निर्णय लिया है।
So in the final analysis, Kenya must find ways to service its debt without punishing its people. the debt crisis is not confined to Kenya. It underscores the challenges faced by many African nations in balancing development goals with financial stability. A collaborative approach involving fair taxation, debt restructuring, and seeing Chinese credit for what it is could be the answer to debt woes of Kenya, the African continent, and the global south.